Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Daily Beacons Politics Podcast. I am your host, Jared Nelson. I've got our usual crew around me for the first time in, probably 3 weeks, which has been mostly my fault since I've been out of town every week. Okay, so we're going to do quick introductions. We have Emma Hines, who writes Environmental on Thursday.
Hi, everyone.
Just the hi?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Owen Flomberg, who writes Living the Dream on Tuesdays.
How's it going?
It's not bad. How about you?
You know, just living the dream.
There it is. Alright, the episode has started now, and we are we're good to go. Zach Osborne, who writes Law and Order on Thursdays.
That's about right.
Yeah, that's it. What's going on, Zach?
I'm not living the dream.
You're not living the
At
dream?
all.
What's going on with that then?
I'm
What's
a senior
the nightmare?
in college.
That's fair.
So, yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah. And last but not least, Cindy Tyndall writes From My Perspective on Fridays. What's up?
I can one up you. I've got grad school problems, so.
Zach's gonna have law school problems in like a year, so.
Got about 4 projects due in like a week and a half, like 2 weeks-ish, just trying to get it all together, and it's a lot.
That sounds brutal. I have 3 assignments left until I graduate, everybody.
Must be nice.
It's awesome. Anywho, today we're talking about the mother of all topics, the white whale, the thing that CNN enjoys talking about more than just about anything. And no, it's not the P-tape. It's
Stormy Daniels?
It's not, well, it's kind of Stormy Daniels. It's corruption.
Yeah.
So,
Oh.
as we have seen in the last couple of weeks, honestly, probably since the start of the administration, charges of corruption, whether they be financial, political, anything, have been leveled against both President Trump and the administration. Most recently, this has conflated into 2 very publicized stories, although one has recently fallen out of the news, and we might talk about why that is. And it might be just because of the other one. And those are the cases of Scott Pruitt, who is the current head of the EPA, head administrator there, and Michael Cohen, who is the president's personal lawyer. We're going to start with Scott Pruitt first, because I think it's interesting and kind of emblematic of the larger issue here. So if you're unaware, Scott Pruitt, who is the head of the EPA, has had some issues in the news, to say the least. It was this, I think Politico reported that he had been staying in an oil lobbyist or coal lobbyist's home for $50 a night in D.C. while he lived in D.C. He's the former Attorney General of Oklahoma and flies back to Oklahoma quite often, which is the charge of the other thing, which is that he's been charging first class to the government dime every time he flies home to Oklahoma, which is quite a lot. Interestingly, he hasn't flown first class any time that he's had to pay out of his own pocket for this. His justification for this is that he needs the first class space for his security detail, which consists of over 20 people for the EPA administrator. And going along with that security, he's installed a private phone booth in his office for $43,000. He's put bulletproof glass in his office, in all the windows, essentially walling himself off from the rest of the EPA, and just been charging these kind of exorbitant rates to basically any like government bill he can find. Outside of that, he also approved pay raises for 2 aides that worked with him in Oklahoma who now work at the EPA, and these aren't just like regular raises, these are raises upwards of $20,000. He did not get approval for these raises. He used a very obscure portion of the 1973 Clean Water Act, I believe, that essentially allows the EPA to sign on consultants without administration approval for a specific amount of time. So he initially tried to get these people their raises the normal way. They said, no, you can't pay them this much. And then he fired them and then rehired them as these consultants with the higher pay, which looks a little bit sketchy, to say the least. So basically what I want to talk about here is that we've seen people, whether it's Ben Carson's $23,000, $31,000 desk, Tom Price charging exorbitant amounts of money to fly around the country, the former head of HHS. And we've seen this kind of thing happening a lot, and we've seen charges of corruption leveled. And I'm just kind of curious for a couple of perspectives on why this seems to be happening more often than it has with anyone else. Like, these are relatively low-level cabinet members doing this type of thing for really ancillary reasons. And I was curious why we think that is, and both the legal implications of this, whether it's like totally illegal and how you get rid of a cabinet secretary. So I'm going to start with Zach here. Zach, what do you think? Do you think this is emblematic of a larger culture?
So, the burden on our current legislature is that they exist as a check on the executive. When the executive gets out of control, they either pass regulations that say that they can't act in a certain way, or they use committees and task forces to start investigations, do whatever they need to do to keep their spending in check. What has happened instead is that they have turned a blind eye to it, and I think that this is... I have a theory about this. As long as they're not doing anything egregiously criminal, it is just attention seeking enough to pull the public's eye away from whatever might be happening as far as like policy decisions are concerned within Congress. Congress's approval rating right now is like 14%,
Probably
maybe lower.
Yeah.
And the Trump administration's agenda as a whole isn't really being enacted like they want it to. It's not been smooth, to say the least. So I think that this is kind of an example of maybe trying to scapegoat something that's not necessarily consequential, but is kind of visible enough to pull attention away so that they can say, hey, well, at least we're not doing this.
So you see it as a congressional thing?
Absolutely.
You think that it's an intentional decision by
to turn a blind eye to their actions? Absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
It seems, especially with the way that the public is related to, or has reacted to, say, like the tax cuts or the failure to pass healthcare reform, they need a win, and any way that they can push pressure off themselves is,
Interesting.
close.
Sydney, what do you think about that?
I agree. I think that Congress is kind of turning a blind eye in a way, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Scott Pruitt is giving them what they want as far as policy. It's no secret, and Emma, you can talk more about this since you're the
I was gonna go right
environmental
there.
guru. It's really not a secret. They don't really value the scientific findings of climate change. They want to go back to coal as an energy source, which is just ridiculously stupid, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but that's what they want. As far as I know, he's decreased funding for the EPA in a lot of areas, which is another area where they think that we're spending too much. So I think that they're in, not only with environmental things, but I think in a lot of different areas you see that when you give Republicans what they want as far as policy, the shady dealings of whoever's in charge kind of go unnoticed, or they turn a blind eye to it. But yes, I totally agree with Zach that when you give them what they want, they just kind of turn a blind eye to corruption.
So what has Scott Pruitt exactly been doing at EPA that would make him such a valuable figure to survive this? Because what we've seen is, in the instances of a lot of these corrupt figures, I'm going to use corrupt loosely here, but figures that have encountered these like PR scandals, a lot of them have resigned or been fired. David Shulkin, who is the head of the Veterans Affairs Office, came under some scrutiny for spending there on himself and his wife. He's gone now. Tom Price, who is the head of Health and Human Services, was spending lavishly on plane rides across the country, exactly the same thing Scott Pruitt has been doing, and was fired there, but notably was fired after the healthcare bill failed. So the one thing that he was supposed to shepherd through didn't happen. And, same with Shulkin, the VA has, come under the similar type of fire, and he's gone now. So what has Scott Pruitt been doing at the EPA that allows him to kind of weather the storm?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is simpler than we like to think it is, but it's because he's not doing anything.
Okay.
I think for the other cabinet members, like you said, there's something that they've been doing that kind of is like the point of when they get fired. Like, yes, the spending is bad, but then they get fired because of something else, but I don't think Scott Pruitt has done anything crazy enough to get to that point. I think he's doing absolutely nothing. This is personal opinion, but he's also not qualified for the job, which is kind of my little tangent. He has zero environmental experience. Doesn't care at all. He's outwardly said that he doesn't believe in climate change, which is pretty bogus, honestly. But I think because he's not doing anything, he can't get in trouble for anything big. So there hasn't been like a red flag kind of a policy move that he's
Didn't he,
butchered.
sorry to interrupt you, but didn't he, before he was given the position, didn't he, like, have a record of suing the EPA?
He is.
Yep.
He is. Yeah.
And, yeah, like he wanted to destroy it. He didn't think that it even needed to be a government entity anymore.
Do you think that just his like level of clearly the Trump administration, by picking Scott Pruitt, wanted to send a message about what they think about the EPA, which Scott Pruitt's whole thing with the EPA is that they're overreaching, they overregulate. A lot of the stuff that they believe is bogus, not true. So you think that just his inaction in the agency and his ability, his like willingness to just not enforce a lot of what the agency does is an asset in and of itself.
Correct. I mean, if you look at the former head of the EPA, her name was Gina McCarthy. She was the assistant administrator for the EPA for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And before that, she worked for the Connecticut version of the EPA, like lifelong environmental activist kind of a person. And then you get Scott Pruitt, who has never had anything to do with the environment besides suing the EPA. So I think that was a very, very clear choice.
Yeah, he's the previous Attorney General of Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And had sued them with regards to a lot of oil fracking
Right.
regulations and stuff like that. That's interesting. So Owen, I want to ask you, what do you think this says about the larger culture of the... Do you think that this has implications for the larger culture of the administration, or are these just isolated bad actors within it?
That's a good question. I think that President Trump is the all-time pro of weathering storms. He really is. You talk about like, oh, they need to put their head down. These various secretaries and whatnot put their head down and weather storms and whatnot. I think he's the pro, and we saw this especially through the election season. Is every a subjectively, I guess, crazy thing that he did throughout the election season, the pundits would all come out and say, "This is what will end up. This is what will end up. This is what will end up," and even things that he's done during his administration. This is what will end up. This is what will end up, and we just haven't seen any sort of final blow. And I do firmly believe that there was a lot of corruption during the campaign season and during this administration, but like I said, it just seems like nothing really sticks. And I think because he's an artist in that sense, and I think this administration, it takes it's an art form, it really is being able to divert attention from what really matters. And I think that President Trump and his administration, with his corruption and everything, has played the media like a fiddle since the day he said that he was going to run.
I guess you could say he makes the best deals.
There's so much winning.
Yeah.
I think you're right with the distractions too. A lot of people think that bombing Syria was a distraction from the Cohen raid because that happened around the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much he thinks through personally the decisions. I think that the Occam's razor with most people, or at least with President Trump, based on past behavior, is very impulsive. And kind of makes decisions on the fly and how things feel in the moment. And granted, that does lead, I think, almost as a byproduct maybe, as a sense of distraction. And so do you think that, like, essentially them observing his ability and the way that the news cycle has worked around the administration, essentially a lot of these people, these secretaries doing these things, feel a little bit less pressure, less accountability, because they know, oh, in a week it's going to blow over, or it won't be a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't think people give Trump enough credit, and I think tries to create this image that he is not, a mastermind or anything like that, but I really do think that he, like you kind of alluded to it while you were talking there, is that he's just, these are impulsive decisions, and the way the news cycle works, it just kind of works together. I really do think that he consciously, or someone at least consciously, works to distract the media in a way, because it's very easy, I feel like, to control it in a soft way. But yeah, That's kind of just how I see it all. Is if they do something egregious, all they have to do is create another problem or create a distraction. And I think it hasn't been. There's been just so much going on. It's not hard for something like that to happen.
Yeah. And of course, speaking of things that are going on, I think that probably the reason that Scott Pruitt hasn't been fired, which I lend credence to all of your theories, both that he is a useful person at the EPA, more useful than Tom Price was at HSS maybe, and all of these things, but I do think large portions that he's been out of the media now for about probably 5 days, which in our news cycle, as Owen said, is a lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's largely because of the fact that Michael Cohen's law office was raided. So this kind of ties in more personally to the president than Scott Pruitt is. So we've kind of gone through what may be the way that the president operates lends the allowance that gives certain cabinet members to do things a little bit loosely, to put it lightly, more loosely than other past administrations have done. But as we get into the more personal side of how President Trump operates and things directly within his inner circle, Michael Cohen, I think, is kind of emblematic of that. So if you're unaware, Michael Cohen is Trump's personal lawyer. He has, I think, served the Trump organization for over 15 years at this point. Has been with him all the way, basically, original diehard Trump guy. He only has 3 clients. Those 3 clients are, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, are President Trump, the Trump Organization, and, funny enough, Fox News television commentator Sean Hannity. We can get into that a little bit later.
Can't wait.
But Michael Cohen, in a not unprecedented but very surprising move, had his law office raided. This caused kind of I will go ahead and just call it a blow up from the president on Twitter and in other statements, declaring attorney-client privilege dead, these types of things. Now what that means is, if you're unaware, communications between an attorney and their client are privileged. They can't be looked at by law enforcement willy-nilly. You can't just get a warrant for those, really. What you have to do is you have to have credible evidence and high probability that these communications contain either them committing a crime or the people in the communications planning to commit a crime. So it's a very high evidence threshold you have to present. You have to go before a special judge and get approval for this type of thing to later raid a law office. So it's a big deal. Now, what's been said about Cohen largely is that this might not have to do with President Trump and the Russia stuff or whatever else you want to call it, but his personal finances. But I think it's interesting that someone that's been with Trump for so long, that's now immediately under scrutiny, is all of a sudden having their law office raided. And that's a big step forward. So I want to ask Zach, at least at first, what do you think are the potential fallouts from something like this, based on what we know?
So, as you mentioned before, there's an exemption to the rule of attorney-client privilege. It's called the crime fraud exemption. And basically, the exemption says that it only covers the motive of the client if the client is either seeking or conspiring to commit fraud or a crime. What enables them, or why this is so scary and why I think it has really far-reaching ramifications, is the way that these warrants are carried out. You're not going to know what you're looking for beforehand, so you have to get everything. And then you have an unrelated filter team, or whatever you would call them, who don't have any connection to the investigation, go through and pick out the relevant information. Why I think this is especially concerning to those persons involved, whether that's Cohen, whether that's Hannity, whether that's President Trump, or the Trump administration, who's had issues with this in the past, is that when they're going through that information, the only thing that keeps that investigation team from disclosing information not related to the case is their honor and the possible burden of criminal charges being levied against them. Nothing else. So currently, Mueller's team, the investigatory team who went in and...
I do believe, actually, that it was the Southern District of New York's U.S. Attorney's Office that led the raid, so they're probably the people looking at it.
They have everything. they have everything so that includes, and this is like, there's a lot of information that attorneys take down within these meetings. That could be just correspondence. That could be notes on like potential suits that he wants to seek in the future. That could be contingencies to potential suits or strategies. If we get sued, if this Stormy Daniels thing starts to cascade a little bit too quickly, this is how we're going to approach it. We're going to try to get it thrown out. We're going to do X, Y, Z. We're going to offer, this, and this. We have 3 or 4 other Playboy stars, whatever, that are starting to come to the table. How do we react if that becomes a class action? Especially in these meetings, I think the most salient, and I'm going to quit before I become too long-winded, I think the most salient piece of information is correspondence. If I go and speak to my attorney and they're like, hey, you were arrested for, say, I don't know, it's 420, marijuana possession. Maybe I told the cops, no, it's not on me, that's someone else's. I'm going to tell my attorney that is mine, because it helps them craft their case. You have to be honest with your attorney.
Yeah.
So if Cohen, which if he's a good lawyer, is keeping notes of that correspondence that he can refer to later, he's going to have something like that. And whether or not something like that comes out and it's especially damning, or if, something is leaked, I think that therein lies the potential for this to be especially harmful to the interests of Trump, the Trump organization, and Sean Hannity.
Yes. The Sean Hannity thing is particularly interesting to me for a variety of reasons. If you don't know, Sean Hannity hosts a 9 p.m. show on Fox News every night in the weekdays, and he is, to put it lightly, a Trump supporter. The show recently has focused on, I would argue conspiratorial, but you can view it one way or the other, attacks on the special counsel investigation, saying that there's a Mueller crime family, things like this. And he's also interviewed Michael Cohen numerous times on his show and never disclosed that was his lawyer that he was interviewing. So that's a whole other issue with journalistic ethics. If you were to ask me, at least as somebody that works for a paper, I can't have somebody on here that is my lawyer and interview them as it's looking for facts or just as a commentator and not disclose, hey, I have a very close personal relationship with this person and they know all of my dark secrets and represent me in court. That's a little bit weird, to say the least. And it's especially weird that it's Sean Hannity, who is somebody that reportedly talks to the president on a semi-regular basis on the phone or however. It's been reported in the New York Times a couple times that Trump will just call him or he'll call him and they'll talk about how things are going or whatnot. And so that's really interesting, but I think the thing that Cohen has and that they're focusing in on most, at least when they talks about Cohen's personal finances and financial issues, might be this Stormy Daniels payment. So if you're unaware, Michael Cohen, beyond being Trump's personal lawyer, is also the deputy head of finance for the RNC. That's a committee the finance part of the RNC was headed by Steve Wynn, who was resigned over sexual harassment allegations recently. But essentially, at some point during the election, Michael Cohen paid Stormy Daniels, who has said that she had an affair with President Trump right after his youngest son was born, $130,000 of hush money to be quiet about the affair. This was, I believe, in October of 2016, so right in the heat of the election. The funny thing is, of course, is that she was paid this money to sign an NDA agreement, a non-disclosure agreement, to never talk about it, but the president never signed the agreement. And so her lawyers have argued that it is non-binding. Michael Cohen has said that President Trump didn't know about this payment, which would mean that he entered into an agreement on his client's behalf without consulting his client, which don't even get me started on the bad practices that implies about being an attorney. But if communication said President Trump didn't know about this payment, didn't whatever, it either gets Michael Cohen in a whole heaping of legal trouble for doing this without his client's permission, or it could be that they could both be in trouble for some sort of campaign finance violation. If the funds used, the $130,000 were taken from the Trump campaign, that's a campaign finance violation. If anybody remembers John Edwards in this room, do you know who John Edwards is?
Mm-hmm.
John Edwards was a South Carolina Democrat, pretty popular rising star back in 2008-ish. Ran for president a couple times.
He was Kerry's running mate when he ran.
Yes, he was John
against
Kerry's
Bush.
running mate in
Yeah.
2004. He was kind of a Dem rising star, and then it comes out that he had a secret love child with this woman, and not only that, but paid her and a lot of the baby's expenses and things like that with campaign funds, which is illegal. And so that kind of ended his political career. And I've seen a lot of comparisons to that. So I think that what we're going to see from Cohen is going to be interesting, depending on what comes out of that and the crime fraud provision. But as a final little, at least note on this, I'm kind of curious. It seems like things are ramping up, and could be wrong. Getting a little bit faster speed-wise in terms of the revelations that are happening. I want to know if you agree with that, if you feel like we're reaching some sort of peak, or if it's just business as usual, and how you see this whole thing, like with all of these corruption things, ending. Do you see it ending in some sort of legal action? Do you see it just kind of going away? Basically, I'm asking you to say what politics is going to look like for the next 2 years, which is a large question.
It's going to depend on a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Is what I would say.
Yes.
So I want to say that this is it, that this is the smoking gun, but I've said it like 5 times now, and it just seems like nothing will actually be that smoking gun. As far as the payments go, I know that in the raid they also found some settlement information from Karen McDougal, who was another Playboy playmate that Trump slept with and might have paid off as well. So there's that, and I think her NDA is also invalid now too, so she's free to talk about that.
Well, what happened
Right.
with her, because I know what you're talking about,
Mhm.
she signed an agreement with the National Enquirer to buy her story, essentially, and then she takes out an NDA on it so they get exclusive rights to the story, but they never published it.
Mm-hmm.
So they essentially bought the story to kill it, which the head of the National Enquirer has, I cannot remember his name right now, but he has a long relationship of doing this for President Trump. They know each other from
Right.
back in the 80s and 90s, tabloid days.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that I think is going to come out of it too.
Mhm.
Maybe just more information about that. The Stormy Daniels thing. I don't know if we could maybe figure out the threatening part of that story within what was found in
Mhm.
Cohen's office or not. With Trump's personal finances, I think that there would be a lot there. I think that his money and maybe the money within the Trump organization is how you find any sort of entanglement with Russia or any kind of sort of fraudulent or corrupt business deal he's done. I say follow the money. For Robert Mueller, just like my advice to him would be follow the money.
Yeah.
There's a reason he didn't want to release his tax returns. There's a reason he doesn't have full financial transparency, and I think that's it. But as far as are we gonna get justice, I don't know. That's really it's if there is probable proof of a crime that comes out, I think the Republicans are gonna have to make a choice about, do you want to keep this really corrupt man in, or do you want to try to impeach him, or are you just going to let it slide because he's a Republican and you're getting what you want as far as policy, and wait until the Democrats hopefully, please God, take back the House and the Senate in the midterms. So it depends.
Zach, what do you think? Or you want to go on that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was just going to kind of build off of that. Similar to what you were saying, I feel like in terms of what I think politics is going to be like, honestly, I have no idea anymore, because I would have thought that it all had, would have changed in 2016. I mean, there were different points throughout the campaign trail, Owen was saying, this is what's going to end him. This is the end. This is the last straw before he gets impeached or Republicans finally turn their back on him. But it hasn't happened yet. And it's honestly baffling that the Conservative Party is even, they're the traditional conservative Christian family values kind of thing. And they're like,
Law and order.
yeah.
Law and order.
Exactly.
That only applies if you are an illegal immigrant or you're a black person getting shot by the police.
That's what I'm
That's
hearing
what they.
nowadays.
That's when they say it.
but
When you're white and you commit fraud and you don't pay your taxes,
It's fine.
It's fine.
Yeah. But if someone had told me 3 years ago that the President of the United States would be sleeping with a porn star and paying her off and Republicans wouldn't care, I would honestly probably fall over dead, because that is something that I would never predict. So who knows, maybe it's going to get crazier, I have no idea. because it's all kind of gone to hell from here. So
Do you think that the Hello. I'm just gonna edit it back in. But do you think so with the Cohen raid and stuff? And I like this like way of thinking about it from like a historical framing perspective. Is this something that when you read and I'm getting this from somewhere else, but when you read the 2-page history of the Trump presidency in your history book in 50 years, is the Cohen raid, is that going to be something that's mentioned?
Like the beginning of the end.
Like, do you think that that's going to be written down, or do you think that that's just kind of going to get lost in the whatever happens in the next 2 to 3 years?
that is a really good question. I think it depends on what comes out of it. If they find incredibly damning evidence or anything like that, then yeah, I think they're going to say that this is the beginning of the end. But if it's evidence that's no less controversial than everything that has happened so far in this administration, then I think it's going to get lost.
Okay. Owen, what about you?
So you're familiar with the story of Al Capone
Yeah.
and how, so he was a mafia guy and involved in, the various gangs and everything. And the feds were always after him, and everyone was always trying to catch him, and because everyone knew he was doing illegal things, but no one could actually get proof. I feel like it's kind of similar, and I think we can learn a little bit from that moment, because when they finally got him, it was on tax evasion or something like that. It seemed like a very minor thing, and not the big crime or the big corruption that he was really involved with. But that's what they got him on. And I think that this whole raid has the potential of maybe finding that little thing that it's kind of like you really can't refute it at all. It's actually damning, even though there's been all these much larger claims and these much larger kind of instances of, pretty blatant corruption, but not enough proof for it to get anywhere. So maybe this will be, have some sort of evidence or something that will actually be the last nail in the coffin. But I don't know, it kind of reminds me a lot of that, because we see so much corruption, or what looks like corruption, with Trump and with this administration, but it's just nothing has been solidified, be proven at all.
Zach?
I've sat here for 3 minutes trying to figure out how I'm going to answer this question. And I think I'm going to do it by promulgating a conspiracy theory.
Oh boy.
Yay!
Well, so I think this one's legitimate. So I think that nothing happens. I think that we see a lot of sound bites, and we see a lot of, we see maybe some phrases from their correspondence that's that does it. And for anybody else, that would do it. For him, it doesn't. And what it's going to do is it's going to embolden him. He's going to be like, if I can get away with this, I can get away with anything. And the thing that I think is going to be the downfall of Trump, the Trump administration, however you want to phrase it, is he is going to recognize that his true power lies not in the policy that he makes and that's what people are afraid of, is he's going to make standing policy changes that are going to last for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 decades. They're going to irreparably damage our democracy. I don't worry about that as much as I do him realizing that his true power in the immediate is that he can manipulate our economy and he can manipulate markets depending on how pissy he gets on Twitter. So we saw this when he lashed out against Amazon. Their stock dropped 4%. No other indicator. So what I think is going to happen is he's going to start to play with that a bit. Because up until now, it's just been damage. So now he's going to start to look at that and say, how can I help my friends? How can I help my campaign financiers? And then, I think the eventual end is we start to see some form of economic or securities fraud that is directly related to his policy decisions. It is pure conjecture. But that being said, I feel like that it is an eventuality that is big enough on everyone's radar. Because when you start screwing with people's money, that's really when they get mad. Unless you're hurting me physically, the next thing that I care about is money. Because it ensures security, safety, whatever you want to call it. So that's where I think Congress draws the line. Because without without their involvement, he can just keep doing this
Yeah,
stuff.
and that would be my last point would be that I think that answering that question, and it is kind of unfair, because I think that so much of it depends on what Congress looks like in 2 years. I think that if you like have the current Congress or some form of it, a Republican-controlled Congress, they've shown a willingness, like we discussed with Scott Pruitt, to kind of let a lot of the more rigorous stuff, like their rigorous checks, slide if they're getting policy outcomes that they enjoy, like Emma talked about of what he's doing. And I think that's largely true for Trump too. Like if they're kind of getting things that they want, they're willing to let some things slide. But I think that if Democrats take back the House in 2018, I think that whole thing gets flipped on its head, and you start seeing the Judiciary Committee, special investigations, just the full bore of the U.S. Congress essentially dedicated to ripping him apart, whether that's in preparation for impeachment or in preparation for a 2020 election. And it could really, I mean, it might behoove them to wait till 2020. Like, impeachment's a long, messy, difficult process. It's never worked in the history of this country. We've been around for over about 250 years, and it's never ever worked. So I think that they're going to make that calculation if they were to win power. But I think that if they don't win power, I think that you're going to largely see maybe a more emboldened Trump. But I think that you're also going to see a Trump that gets a little bit more bored with a lot of what he's doing as the presidency stretches on. And I don't know what that looks like. Maybe it looks like him being on Twitter more, which I think is hard to imagine for some people. Or maybe it looks like him just not being on Twitter, not really doing much. But I think that that's kind of where this goes, depending on how 2018 turns out. But that's where we'll leave it. Thank you all for listening in. Does anybody have any parting words? Any final greetings? Just silence.
This crap's exhausting.
It is. Anyway, we're wrapping up. We're getting there.
Do the right thing.
Do the right thing. Yeah.
Be nice to one another.
Final advice, do the right thing. Be nice to people.
Corruption is just a construct.
Corruption is a construct. Zach?
Oh, it's currently 4:27 on a Friday.
Oh, you just dated
And
us, boy.
We
We
missed
just-
420 on 420.
We just
Oh, well.
no, I'm done.
Can't hotbox the studio, sadly.
Oh my god, are you gonna put that on there?
Yeah, it's staying then.
Okay.
Sydney?
I don't know. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Yeah. Good luck with finals. That's all I got to.
It's been a ride.
As it has, just living the dream. Nope, that's not my thing. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you all for listening.
I am
We'll see
the
you-
dream.
Oh my gosh.